Hello, I'm Jorge Gestoso. Welcome to a new program. On today's show, we'll be discussing immigration under President Trump and the future of the Dreamers with Daniella Burgi-Palomino, Senior Associate for Mexico, Border and Migration Issues with the Latin America Working Group. Daniella, welcome to the program.
Thank you, Jorge.
Daniella, what is your assessment of the first year of President Trump regarding immigration issues?
Well, it's really been a horrible and difficult year for immigrants and refugees from all over the world, but in particular, as you know, from members of our Latino community here in the U.S. and their families abroad. We've just seen constant attacks against this population, starting with the president's executive orders in January, going through a series of principles that he's repeated over and over under his administration, his wish list for what he would like immigration to look like for this country, which, let's be honest, is just one that restricts immigration, both undocumented immigration and legal immigration even, at all costs, and is sort of a racist, xenophobic, restrictive, one of the most conservative views of immigration we've ever seen.
So now being the devil's advocate, and regarding undocumented immigration, is it wrong what he's saying that he's concerned about the safety of the borders of the U.S.? Is it logical that people get into this country with no rights to be here?
The border communities along the U.S.-Mexico border are some of the safest in the country, in the U.S. So his rhetoric that immigrants are pouring into the U.S. by the thousands really is completely false. We've seen numbers crossing into the border being at some of the lowest that they've been since the 1970s. And the people who are trying to enter the U.S. are people who are fleeing violence, really, mostly these days from Central America, families and children who are trying to receive international protection in the U.S.
Again, devil's advocate. Is it hypocritical from our Latin American countries that we are extremely hard denouncing immigration, how the undocumented immigrants are being treated in this country when, for example, Haitians fleeing from Haiti have trouble with their boats and they stop in Cuba. And the first thing that the Cubans are saying is, as soon as you fix your boat, get out of here because we don't like you here. The way that Mexicans are treating Central Americans, raping them, pushing them to be members of gangs, and all women being violated and raped, and that is a common denominator, and they have the quote-unquote, for many people here, the guts to denounce how immigrants undocumented are being treated in the U.S. when in Latin American countries are treating much worse the undocumented immigrants. What do you say?
Well, I think all countries have a right to protect their borders and protect their national sovereignty, but they also have a responsibility, like you're saying, to protect the rights of immigrants and refugees seeking protection at their border. And there we've certainly seen countries like Mexico play both sides of the card, talking about how they want to protect Mexican immigrants in the U.S., particularly now in these moments when they're under attack by the president's apprehension orders, but refusing to protect Central American migrants who are increasingly wanting to stay in Mexico and seek protection there. So you're totally right. Attitudes like that are hypocritical, but I think at this point, Central American countries, Mexico, need to step up their protection services through their consulates that they have to protect their immigrants here in the U.S.
You were mentioning that President Trump is a racist, and you say that we're talking about xenophobia. Is he especially racist with Latin Americans, or this is a generic type of racism?
I think it's a generic type of racism. He's put out, like I said, and some of his advisors, Stephen Miller, for example, have put out this view of who the immigrant should be to the U.S. and what it really, under all the language of merits-based point system, skills-based system, what they're really talking about is a view of practically no immigrants, and if there were to be immigrants, it would be sort of a white European immigrant that can be easily assimilated, using their words, into the U.S. So I would say it's against all immigrants and refugees.
And in that sort of preference, if you want, for legal immigration that he's proposing, he's perceiving our Latin American, most of our Latin American people coming here like workforce with no specialization.
Not only that, yes, but also, yes, people who are not contributing to the society at all and to the U.S. economy, which is completely false. But also as criminals, when there's been numerous studies made to show that immigrants and their second-generation children commit the least crimes among the U.S. society, and also as rapists and gang members. Gang members, the last one particularly has been applied to unaccompanied children from Central America who are actually fleeing the gangs. They're not gang members themselves.
Here, when you and I live in this country, the media is playing a key role. We're talking about the mass media. And we are hearing with much more intensity. For example, Trump's speeches, Trump agenda, picturing Latin Americans, immigrants in general, undocumented and undocumented, mostly as a negative issue. In the case of undocumented immigrants, we're talking that they, as he referred to Mexicans, are rapists, bring drugs and rape and so forth and so forth. And that mass media doesn't put on the air the other side of the coin with the same time and the same intensity. Are there participants of creating that stereotype that we Latin Americans are a negative issue in this country?
Well, I think it depends what media you're talking about. Certainly, we've seen outlets like Breitbart only re-emphasizing the president and the administration's views, but we've also, at least organizations like mine, like a Latin America Working Group, and together with other coalition organizations, have really tried to put forward who it is that we're talking about, like the Dreamers, like the temporary protected status holders, the millions of other immigrants that are business owners, that are students, that are homeowners in this country. And there, I think there have been some media outlets that are trying to present this view and trying to lift up the voices of members of our Latino community.
Do you think that is even, we're talking about audiences, we're talking about networks, national networks that put Donald Trump time and time again with that speech reinforcing that negative, demonizing Hispanics and undocumented immigrants, and as you said, very good, some specific outlets. Is it even, or basically we're talking about the majority of the Americans get systematically that idea in their heads?
I think this has to do a lot in terms of audience of where the person is sitting. So here in DC and New York, we're used to seeing outlets like the Washington Post and like the New York Times lifting up many of these stories, reportive investigations, looking into the administration and what it's really doing. But you're right that a large part of the country doesn't hear or read these media outlets, or frankly doesn't have any interest in reading them and has seen them as an attack on the white middle working class. And they're, in some degree they're right, because their issues have not really been listened to either. The steel worker in Scranton, Pennsylvania, or elsewhere in the South, for example. And so, but I think there's a lot of potential. So we're talking about two different Americas constantly, and I think the messages are not really getting across about, for example, who their neighbors are, or how limiting, legal immigration would also impact, their jobs and their economy. So there is a divide, and it matters very much on where you're seated. But I think we're constantly trying to bridge that gap and to remind folks that, who makes up the U.S. And that's both, middle class, white middle class workers, and also the immigrants.
There is this perception that there is, if you want, racism, xenophobia. We're talking about the white nationalism being exacerbated under Trump. That racism existed all over the time, all over the history of the U.S. Is it more now? And Trump is using that just for political purposes, of he's deeply convinced that he's racist and therefore he's projecting that vision of the world. Is he trying to get votes and that's about it?
I think the racism has certainly always been there. It's existed there. We have in this country, as you well know, not just an issue with the Latino population, but also with, several other minorities, the African American population, who's been systematically underserved. Exactly, on Muslims as well. So it's always been there. What this administration has done is made it okay to, use this rhetoric on a daily basis, and has exacerbated the level of racism that already existed.
What your organization is finding out regarding raids and deportations and the way they're being conducted?
We have, and our partners have seen over the last year in 2017 an increase of 40% of apprehensions of undocumented immigrants. The majority of the Latino community, but also across the board. Basically, raids and apprehensions of undocumented immigrants are happening without any sort of priority. So under the Obama administration, you saw at least an attempt to prioritize who was getting arrested, even though, we know President Obama's immigration policies were not perfect by any means. He deported more people than any other president in the last couple of years. But right now we're seeing no priorities, and we're seeing immigration enforcement agencies that are completely empowered in the way that they're making arrests, stopping people at traffic stops. And the people who are getting arrested are mothers, fathers of U.S. citizen children who have lived their whole lives here. People like Rosa Maria Hernandez, who, a 10-year-old girl in Texas with cerebral palsy, who was stopped on the way to the hospital by Border Patrol agents. So these are the kinds of arrests that we're seeing, and they are certainly, I think, going to continue. And the administration has applauded these efforts.
Would you consider it cruel?
It's completely cruel. It doesn't make any sense from also a fiscal standpoint. In terms of the Dreamers, who are, another population severely at risk, we're talking that it would cost $400 billion to deport the 800,000 Dreamers. And really it would impact the U.S. economy. It would impact the businesses that many of these immigrants own here. So the impacts would be devastating. I do think they're cruel because they're separating families. That's been something that the administration has used over and over again since the beginning of the year as a threat. That it will continue doing that to stop people from coming to the U.S. So it's very cruel. It's immoral, but more importantly, I think it would have severe impacts on the U.S. economy as well.
What is going to be the future of the Dreamers? Your assessment?
We're at an extremely urgent point right now. As you know, last year in September, the president made the decision to phase out, to end the program, and he only gave Dreamers 1 month to renew their status. Every day that a DREAM Act, which is a piece of legislation that would allow Dreamers a passage to green card and then citizenship, every day that we're waiting on that, which Congress right now is stuck on that, 122 Dreamers lose their status. There's already been 14,000 that have lost their status since September. We are pressuring Congress right now to pass a DREAM Act as soon as possible, because the reality is that Dreamers can't wait until March 8th, which is the deadline that the administration gave them. So we're hopeful that a DREAM Act will pass this month, or hopefully in the next 2 months.
Donald Trump, initially, among the many viewpoints that he has, because he tends to change viewpoints quite often, he was projecting himself as being sort of in favor to regularize the situation of the Dreamers, and then came with the magic idea of tying up his approval of the future of the Dreamers with the build of the construction of the wall with the border of Mexico.
Yes, so basically at the end of last year, Congress failed to pass a decision on the DREAM Act and on the spending for the wall. So right now, Democrats and Republicans have been in negotiations this week, and they will be through next week. They have until January 19th, otherwise there will be a government shutdown. We didn't really know what the president meant by, the border wall, because that can mean technology, infrastructure, and we just heard today that he's talking about $33 billion for border security funding. $18 billion of that would be for the border wall, which would expand the already 650,000 miles of the wall that already exist, and that also include technology, infrastructure, hiring of more Border Patrol agents. So that's the negotiation that's going to be key right now. I think Democrats need to hold the line and basically say, we want a DREAM Act, but we don't want that to be negotiated for this ridiculous amount of money that he's proposing.
What about the TPS, the temporary protection status for mostly Central Americans and some Caribbean countries?
Yeah, that's another population that's currently at risk. We're expecting a decision any moment now on the 195,000 Salvadorans who, as status, the administration needs to make a decision on whether it's going to renew temporary protected status for 18 months, which is what we're pushing for, or end it like it has done already for Haitians, like it's done already for Nicaraguans. And the important thing here is that this population, the majority of which actually live in this area in DC, Maryland, and Virginia, they're basically permanent residents. They've been living here for the past 20 years. They're homeowners, they're business owners, and they also, don't deserve their status to just be ended. It's been renewed time and time again.
One of the assessment of some analysts is saying that regarding the TPS, that could create a very negative impact in the economies of the Central American countries, for example, if those people are going to be sent back to their countries, is that President Trump is playing his cards with those governments, saying that if I would let your TPS people stay in the US, in exchange, I want your support to try to bash or trying to oust progressive governments in Latin America, for example, Venezuela and, for example, Bolivia, because most definitely I want them out of the picture, and that is a tool, that's a liability that he's trying to play with. Have you heard something on that matter?
Not really. I think his administration has reiterated over and over that temporary protected status is just temporary, and that's why it needs to be ended. I don't think the administration is considering, to the degree that it should, the impact that ending TPS for Salvadorans and Hondurans could impact the prosperity and security and stability of Central America, like you're saying. Salvadorans contribute 17% in remittances and money that they send back to their to El Salvador.
What is the issue that concerns you the most regarding migration in this 2018?
I think we're going to see a continuation of aggressive immigration enforcement, of apprehensions of undocumented immigrants here, probably an increase in deportation starting to happen. We haven't seen a drastic increase yet. I think we're going to probably see that this year, and that is going to require, and that's going to mean basically more people going into the shadows, more people fearing for their lives, and it's going to require organizations like ours to increase our services here in the U.S. and also work with civil society in Mexico and Central America to receive many of these family members, members of our communities that may be forced to return.
What about the relations between the U.S. and Mexico regarding immigration as of today, and what to expect during 2018?
As of today, I think we've seen a little movement on this part of the bilateral relationship in the last year. The rhetoric has been, on immigration enforcement, on how to work together to combat drugs, on how to improve security between the two countries, to root out organized crime. And frankly, from our position, we're very concerned, one, that the U.S. could threaten to pull out of NAFTA, for example, a trade agreement, and that might, force Mexico to put on the table the negotiating chips, such as, to what degree it's going to close its borders to Central American migrants. So I think what we can expect for 2018 are these types of negotiations between the two countries where immigration constantly is raised to the forefront. And we hope that it's not going to take the line of both countries stepping up their immigration enforcement.
For many people, the issue of undocumented immigrants here in the U.S. is being perceived as a huge hypocrisy, because in many cases they perceive it as the result of trade policies of the U.S. regarding Latin America, that they are creating modern slavery and they are benefiting from that modern slaves. We're talking about millions of people that are work under awful working conditions, are not being paid, there's no safety. Is that true, that it basically this economy is creating modern slavery to benefit from that, and on top of that they demonize the slaves?
Well, the reality is that trade agreements like NAFTA have not benefited, anyone on both sides of the border besides corporations. And so this effort to speed up negotiations around NAFTA are not going to benefit workers on both sides of the border, are not going to benefit the environment, and are not going to benefit labor rights. If there's a push to negotiate like there is now and to finalize and have an agreement by March.
Do you believe that it's possible this year an immigration reform? We're talking about a comprehensive immigration reform with a path to citizenship?
I think what we're going to likely see is, a push for more separate and individual legislative proposals, like the DREAM Act, like for TPS right now, for temporary protected status. There's 4 legislative proposals, 4 bills in the House and the Senate, 1 in the Senate right now. So I think we're going to more see sort of individual bills like that to try to address the broken immigration system. The president has recently said that he wants to put forward comprehensive immigration reform. I think we all know, under his view, what that would look like. So I think we're probably going to see the other scenario of individual bills.
In the case of Central America, possible massive return of people who were living for many years in this country could create problems in their economies and in their social fabric?
Completely. It would have a completely destabilizing impact on countries that are already suffering high levels of violence. El Salvador has some of the highest rates of homicides in the world, and definitely for Central America and Latin America. There are high levels of internal displacement where people are fleeing gangs, but also security forces, military and the police. And they are countries that are financially weak also, and that depend very much on the money that immigrants from the U.S. send back to those countries. So by cutting off that system, you would be weakening the countries financially, and also you would potentially be exposing all these immigrants that don't know their country anymore because they've lived in the U.S. for so many years, to levels of violence, to extortion, to gangs. So it would be completely destabilizing.
We have seen some of the representatives of these Central American countries coming here to Washington to lobby not to happen. How successful do you think they're going to be?
I think, for example, El Salvador has done a great effort over the past few months. They've come numerous times, met with various members of Congress. And, I think we have yet to see. We're hopeful. We certainly, as civil society, as NGOs, have joined many of their efforts and have joined, some of their demands. And we're hopeful that all of that has resulted. There's been at least 3 letters by members of Congress with over 100 signatures calling for a renewal of temporary protected status. So we're hopeful that these arguments are reaching, the administration. Particularly the one that needs to make the decision on temporary protected status is the new Secretary of Department of Homeland Security, Secretary Kirstjen Nielsen. And so I'm hopeful that all of this is having some sort of impact.
She was the assistant of the previous director?
Yes.
Who is?
John Kelly.
John Kelly, who was in the past a member of the South Command, not necessarily a very friend of Latin America according to a long history. Is that means that also it's not going to be very beneficial to have her at the helm of that new ministry, as we call it in Latin America?
I think that's correct. What we can expect from her is someone who, is used to being sort of chief of staff. He is chief of staff now, John Kelly's right-hand woman. And so far, what we've seen from her is that she's taking orders from the administration, repeating very much their rhetoric that Central American migrants are gang members, and that she could make decisions that are very similar to what John Kelly himself, had wanted.
This is a year with midterms elections. Both parties are trying to gain some seats in the House of Representatives or the Senate. How the issue of immigration or defending immigrants, you were talking about undocumented immigrants or immigrants in general, or just immigration as an issue, is going to be played by both parties?
Well, immigration has always been played by both parties, including the Democrats, and these midterm elections are going to be a crucial time for their constituents, for members in states and localities to raise all of these issues and to hold members accountable for their votes. We saw a couple of Democrats that haven't been the friendliest on the DREAM Act and those types of issues. So it's going to be a really crucial time to look at those members of Congress that are up for re-election. And to hold them accountable, and including, family members of, Latino communities, Latino immigrants who have been living here in the U.S. need to raise all of those issues.
Daniella Burgi-Palomino, thanks very much for joining us.
Thanks so much, Jorge.